House come to order. The member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Pursuant to Rule 1.22, it's my intention to place Senate File 1808, Lanning Pension Bill, Senate File 1983, McElpatrick, and House File 1752, House Bonding Bill, on the fiscal calendar for today, Thursday, May 3rd, 2012.
Point of parliamentary inquiry.
The member from Scott, Representative Biskin, state your point of parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to House rules, now that this intention has been made, how long does the body have to wait before this can actually be brought up for a vote? How long can we as members talk amongst ourselves, talk amongst our constituency, talk amongst the people who are outside this chamber who are interested in these pieces of legislation? How long must our rules say we have to wait before we can actually vote on this?
Representative Biskins is 2 hours. Messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate. This is the Beard motion. Mr. Speaker, I hereby announce the passage by the Senate of the following House file, herewith returned as amended by the Senate, in which amendment to concurrence of the House is respectfully requested. House File 2685, an act relating to transportation. Beard moves that the House refuse to concur in the Senate amendments to House File 2685 and that the Speaker appoint a conference committee of 3 members of the House to meet with the like committee appointed by the Senate.
Call the member from Scott, Representative Beard, to your motion.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, members, this is the second omnibus bill we did the other morning. The Senate took it up, got it mostly right, but they missed a few things and got a couple things sideways. We just need to iron it out a little bit. So I'd appreciate your support on the motion.
Discussion of the motion. Seeing no further motion, all those in favor of the Beard motion to refuse to concur in House File 2685 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails.
Message from the Senate. This is the Drazkowski motion. Mr. Speaker, I hereby announce the Senate refuses to concur in the House amendments to Senate File 1755, an act relating to state government. The Senate respectfully requests that a conference committee be appointed thereon. Senate conferees Gazelka, DeCriff, and Daly. Drazkowski moves that the House accede to the request of the Senate and that the Speaker appoint a conference committee of 3 members of the House to meet with the like committee appointed by the Senate.
Call the member from Wabasha, Representative Drazkowski, to your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just ask members to agree to cede to the Senate and go to conference.
Discussion to the motion. Discussion. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the Drazkowski motion signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. Calendar for the day. The first bill on the calendar today is Senate File 1212. The Chief Clerk will report the bill.
Senate File 1212, number 28 on the calendar for today, an act relating to health records.
Call the member from Dakota, Representative Holberg, to present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And there's a delete all amendment that I hope is the first amendment being passed out. The base bill, as was heard in Civil Law Committee, would allow adult children to access medical records of their deceased parents. In the Civil Law Committee, we had some discussion about the ability of individuals to prohibit that access in their health directive if they did not want their adult children to have access to their medical records after they died. So the delete all amendment that's being passed out addresses the concerns that were raised in the Civil Law Committee. And so how it would work is after August 1st of 2012, if an individual did not have a prohibition of access to adult children for their medical records, adult children would have the ability to access those medical records of their deceased parents. Currently, in a health directive, an individual can allow for that access, and some do, but moving forward, we will flip the presumption on that and allow access by adult children unless it's prohibited in a health directive. And I'd be happy to stand for any questions on the DE amendment.
The Chief Clerk will report the author's amendment.
Holberg and others moving to amend Senate File 1212 as follows. The amendment is coded DE 1.
The member from Dakota, Representative Holberg, to your author's amendment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, members, I just explained the amendment. If there's any questions, otherwise I'd appreciate your support.
Discussion. The member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Well, members, I think the bill is fine, and I know that I appreciate Representative Holberg's work on this. And would Representative Holberg yield to a question?
She will yield, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Holberg, my one question about this is whether there are also other ways in which a person could limit their adult child's access to their records after their death. So under your amendment, is the only way a person can do that through a health care directive? Or could I say I don't want my children to have my medical records for whatever reason? Can I also direct my health provider in other ways to not release those records?
Member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Mr. Chair and Representative Liebling, you may be able to. I'm certain that probably the best way is to have a health directive, and that's probably the easiest way to make sure. But you could also direct other individuals that had control over your estate, if you will, i.e. the surviving spouse. But as far as a standard in health records, say at the hospital or the clinic, I'm not sure.
Member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Holberg. I think maybe that will be an issue, kind of a continuing question about this, but I do support your amendment. I think it is important to not prohibit adult children, you know, from having access where there's no information about it, because there are many important reasons why adult children might need to get access to a deceased parent's medical records. I think we should maybe continue to think about this in the future, that to make sure that people who have a reason why they don't want that to happen can in fact make sure that it does not. But I do support the amendment.
Discussion. The member from Hennepin, Representative Khan.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Holberg, I don't know if you know, but there are rules that are going through the federal process right now that are going to make all health records, all records public, unless of course there are specifications of refusing it, public records 50 years after a person is deceased, unless there are specific instructions to keep them private. Do you know how this fits into that, and is that something that you're following at all? And do you know, would the federal rule take, and specifically there's always the ability to refuse it if there are any living descendants or anyone like the people listed there, but do you know how that interplays with this?
Representative Holberg will yield. The member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Khan. Well, I haven't followed the issue on a federal level, but I would be hopeful that they would not undo the wishes of a health care directive. It's a pretty standard process with some variation across all 50 states, and I'm guessing that even the federal politicians wouldn't want to undo that.
Further discussion of the author's amendment. Further discussion. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the author's amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The amendment is adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the next amendment.
Holberg and others moving to amend Senate File 1212. The delete everything amendment as follows. The amendment is coded A8.
Call the member from Dakota, Representative Holberg, to-year amendment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I might need help from the front desk. This should not be a delete all amendment. It should be to the DE. It should be, I believe it's drafted to the DE1 amendment.
That is correct. This is an amendment to delete all.
Representative Holberg, the chief clerk assures me this is to the delete all amendment. The amendment is before the member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just making sure. Members, some of you may be aware of a long history in this legislature about struggling over issues around a newborn screening program. All 50 states have a program whereby after a child is born, their heel is pricked and blood is placed on a sample card and is tested for various conditions. Lack of performing this test, in fact, may cause the death of some children. In the state of Minnesota, we have a provision in current law that allows a parent to opt out of the test or have it done privately.
Representative Holberg, 1 minute, please. Members, if you could, please. If you could take your conversations to the alcove, or better yet, the retiring room. There are some members on both sides of the aisle trying to hear Representative Holberg. Thank you, members. Representative Holberg, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what a point of contention over the years is what happens to the blood samples and test results after that initial screening is completed. And for some of us, we, for many, many years, have been trying to get into place the opportunity for parent consent for any activities beyond the initial screening. And in fact, questioned whether or not the Department of Health had the authority to do what they were doing. What happened a number of years ago is Representative Kahn and I worked together to begin to try and address the issue of genetic testing information, technical advances in the medical arena that really hadn't been dealt with any public policy at a state level. And there was a genetic privacy information task force that made recommendations to the legislature, and we, as a result of that, we had the Genetic Privacy Act, which was implemented in law. Fast forward a couple years, and there was a lawsuit brought forward in the state of Minnesota on behalf of children that had been tested, questioning the Department of Health's right to store and use for research those samples and test results. There was a Supreme Court ruling in November of 2011 that in fact held that the Department of Health did not have the authority beyond the initial screening to use the blood samples and test results for other purposes. And in fact, currently, under court agreement, they are destroying all blood samples at 71 days and test results at 2 years, with the exception of the material that they had prior to the court decision, which is being held by court order. So what we're trying to do here with this particular amendment is, after the court decision, the Department of Health began to look at the various programs being conducted and had some concerns whether they really had the express authority, either through rule or law, to conduct the activities that they've been conducting for a number of years. So in plain English, this amendment, actually, I call it the get out of court provision. In other words, we are going to give the Department of Health a pass for their activities between now and July of 2013. In the meantime, they are going to have to comb through the laws and rules relative to the programs that they implement and conduct and determine whether or not they need additional authority given to them by the legislature in order to continue their work. And so, members, I would ask for support on the Eighth Amendment. It allows the Health Department to continue their operations. This particular language does not apply to the newborn screening program. We'll get to that with the next amendment, but does allow them to continue their operations, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss this important issue in more detail in the next legislative session, and I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Discussion to the Holberg Amendment. The member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And just to let members know that I also support this amendment. Representative Holberg's done a lot of work on this and will continue to work in the future. But this amendment represents a compromise, and we need to get this enacted.
Further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the author's amendment signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the next amendment.
Holberg and others moving to amend Senate File 1212 as amended by the Delete Everything Amendment. The amendment is coded A9.
Call the member from Dakota, Representative Holberg, to present your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. Well, this amendment deals directly with the newborn screening program and an effort to comply to the ruling of the Supreme Court from last fall. And in general terms, it's still the provision or the standard for newborn screening is an opt-out. Parents still have the right to opt out and or use a private firm for testing. Then they will provide for a process for consent, for storage and use and dissemination. It will be a robust consent process that will include a tennyson warning. It is the intent of the Health Department to not seek this authority in the hospital, but to rather work with prenatal classes and pediatricians in order to have this decision-making phase be done in an environment with a little bit less stress than the actual hospital setting at the time of birth. In addition, there will be an information sheet similar to what people receive, say, at the time of immunization that will be given to parents at the time of the newborn screening in the hospital. There will be a basic information sheet about the tests and what their rights are in regard to the actual newborn screening program. And then it also provides for protection for the current court cases that have already been filed, that these changes do not negate any claims of action that have already been filed or are a result of behavior or actions in the past. And in addition to that, we also make it very clear that the newborn screening program continues to be governed by the Genetic Privacy Act and the penalties in Chapter 13 for violations of that act. And I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Discussion. The member from Olmsted, Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And once again, I appreciate Representative Holberg's work on this. It's certainly, from my point of view, it's not perfect, but it represents a lot of work on her part to reach a compromise, and so I urge members to support it.
Further discussion. All those in favor of the author's amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the next amendment.
Abler and others moving to amend Senate File 1212 as amended as follows. The amendment is coded 510.
Call the member from Anoka, Representative Abler, to present your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and I hope the page in line is right, or the staff probably fixed that right. It was drafted to the original bill. Mr. Speaker, this is a very small piece that's left over from the Human Service Omnibus time. We were trying to get written appeals on reductions and denials of services. We discovered in our process that was controversial and it cost $106,000. We retreated from that House position. This merely says, we also discovered that these reports are in some crazy legalese and no one can understand them. This merely asks that when they do a denial that it be written in plain language. So I urge your support.
Discussion to the amendment. Discussion. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the amendment signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk report the next amendment.
Abler and others moving to amend Senate File 1212 as amended as follows. The amendment is coded 548.
Calling the member from Anoka, Representative Abler, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This also comes out of the Human Service Omnibus Times. This was the end result of a $2.3 million request for a mandate health benefit study. I thought that was a ridiculous price to pay. We couldn't afford $2.3 million. The department has agreed to put out an RFI, given the parameters of that bill, to see what it really would cost. They've agreed to absorb the $3,000 cost, and this is the Chamber's. They're interested in doing this, so I urge members' support.
Discussion. Discussion to the amendment. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the Abler amendment signify by saying aye. Opposed, nay. The motion prevails. Seeing no further amendments at the desk, the clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File 1212 as amended.
Third reading. Discussion. Discussion to the bill. The member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and I'd just like to say a few words before we vote. This has been a lot of work by a lot of people. Mr. Koppel from the Department of Health, quite frankly, at times I felt like he was stalking me, but it's also a testament to his persistence with this particular issue. Ms. Brace from the Citizens Council on Health Freedom also provide comment, and they're not opposed to this language. And I think finally, after lots of years of not getting too far, we at least have a little progress in this issue. But I would again say to members that we as public policy makers over and over again are behind the curve when it comes to setting public policy with advances in medical science and technology. And anybody that would like to help me in working this area, I would be happy for their help and support.
Further discussion to the bill. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Clerk will close the roll. There being 127 ayes, 0 nays, the bill is passed as amended. Its title is agreed to. If there are no objections, members, announcements by the Speaker.
Announcement by the Speaker. The Speaker announced the appointment of following members of the House to a conference committee on House File 2685. Beard, Benson M., and Nelson. Announcement by the Speaker. The Speaker announced the appointment of following members of the House to a conference committee on Senate File 1755. Drazkowski, Benson M., and Nelson.
Call the member from St. Louis, Representative Murphy M. For what purpose do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, I rise as the most senior representative on the Legislative Reference Library Subcommittee. I have a House resolution to honor an employee.
Representative Murphy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Members, I'm presenting this House resolution to honor Paul Vancouver on his 28 years of outstanding service for the Minnesota Legislative Library. Whereas Paul Vancouver started at the Legislative Reference Library in 1983 as a library aide and has been received 7 promotions since. Whereas a few Minnesotans are more knowledgeable about the quirks and complexities of the legislative process, and Paul's work on the library's legislative history collection and the legislators' past and present database will benefit the legislature and the state of Minnesota for generations to come. And whereas words used to describe Paul include diligent, meticulous, expert, patient, dedicated, inclined to serve, tireless, loyal, friendly, smart, and a wonderful sense of humor that brightens the library. Mr. Speaker, I yield to Representative Dabney, Paul Vancouver's representative.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Dabney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. My privilege to continue the reading of this House resolution honoring Mr. Vancouver for his years of service to us all. Whereas Paul is an exemplary co-worker and friend who will be missed every day, and whereas Paul will be leaving the Legislative Reference Library today, May 3rd, 2012, to be Director of Programs for the National Collegiate Conference Association, which among other things sponsors the National Model United Nations Conferences. Now, be it resolved by the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration of the House of Representatives of the State of Minnesota that it congratulates Paul Vancouver on his 28 years of outstanding service at the Legislative Reference Library and wishes him well in his future plans. Mr. Speaker, members, would you please join me in thanking and congratulating Mr. Vancouver.
Thank you, Representatives Murphy and Dabney. If there are no objections, members, we will revert to messages from the Senate.
Message from the Senate. This is the Shimanski motion. Mr. Speaker, I hereby announce that the Senate has concurred in and adopted the report of the Conference Committee on Senate File 506, an act relating to the courts. Conference Committee report on 506 addressed to the Honorable Michelle L. Fischbach, President of the Senate, the Honorable Kurt Zeller, Speaker of the House, we, the undersigned conferees for Senate File 506, report that we've agreed upon the items in dispute and recommend as follows. The report is signed by all 3 conferees on the part of the Senate and all 3 conferees on the part of the House. Shimanski moves that the report of the Conference Committee on Senate File 506 be adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by Conference Committee.
Call the member from McLeod, Representative Shimanski.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This is the Conciliation Court bill raising the limits on Conciliation Court. The bill has come back to us very much the same form that it left here. The Conciliation Court limit previously was $7,500. We're seeking to raise it to $10,000 for the next 2 years, and then in 2014 raise the Conciliation Court limit to $15,000, which would then coincide with the $15,000 limit on forfeitures under previous legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, ask for the members of the body to vote in support of this conference report, and hope to see green votes on the entire board. Thank you, sir.
Discussion of the Conference Committee report. The member from Hennepin, Representative Mullery.
Mr. Speaker and members, this still has the same problems. We're going to now have the second highest in the country for this, limits to allow corporations to go after regular little people on the street. And as I said before, this is still open to the huge problem with debt buyers and their misuse of the system.
Discussion. The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Chairman Shimanski, can you tell us what the public testimony was with regard to the, during the conference committee, relative to what Representative Mullery's issue is?
Representative Shimanski will yield. The member from McLeod, Representative Shimanski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Atkins, there was no public testimony. The conference committee met informally.
Member from Dakota, Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Shimanski yield once more?
He will yield. Representative Atkins.
Thank you. And Representative Shimanski, when did you meet informally, and what was the public notice that went out for that informal meeting?
The member from McLeod, Representative Shimanski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Atkins, the conference was posted by the Senate, and further details I cannot supply at this time.
Further discussion. All those in favor of adoption of the Conference Committee report signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Opposed. Motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File 506, as amended by conference.
Third reading. Discussion. The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins.
And I'll be very brief, Mr. Speaker. This is, I would ask members contrast this with what Representative Hoppe did the other day. Representative Hoppe, when the bill was amended in the Senate relative to the Mystic Lake and Canterbury Downs agreement, he didn't have to give us notice. It could have just simply come up. He came to us 2 days ahead so that we'd have an opportunity to talk with folks that care. And we did, and it passed. Transpose that or contrast that with what's going on right here. And Representative Shimanski, maybe you can explain to us what the process is, but the other day we had Representative Gottwalt who had 37 minutes notice before a major bill came up before a conference committee. We raised some issues about the process. Now, members, I just ask you, look at what's going on. We had a conference committee that, what I think Representative Shimanski said, informally. And I'm not here. We all get irritable at the end of session, but Representative Shimanski, when there's a conference committee, it needs to meet. There needs to be some notice so that those folks who care have an opportunity to show up. In this case, I believe there were 2 conference committees that met informally, without any notice, without any public testimony. And, well, it may be something that you think is convenient. It's not the way that we should be doing business, particularly when we have apparently several days. We've already blown the deadline of April 30th. At least get together, answer the questions that were raised by Representative Mullery's concern. At one point in this conference committee that met informally without any notice, the prejudgment interest was in there, then it wasn't in there, then we don't know where things are at. That's all we ask. We understand that you have more than enough votes, Mr. Speaker, to pass these things any way you want to, Representative Shimanski. Just give folks an opportunity to be heard regarding what those issues are. I'm going to vote against this now because of that. I was fully prepared to vote in favor of it, very earnestly. I've been thinking about the idea of raising the caps in conciliation court for some time. At this point, I don't know what the testimony would have been. It might have been very elucidating. I asked you to invite me to the conference committee when it met. I never got an invitation, so I assume maybe it just got forgotten. In fact, it never occurred. That's very troubling. Members, please vote against this. Whether you like it or not, it's yet another example of a very, very bad process. And if we let it continue like this, we're going to keep going down this path again and again and again. You got to send a message that we can't do it this way. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for tolerating my little rant. Representative Shimanski, I got all the respect in the world for you, but this process really stunk. Thank you, members.
Further discussion of the bill. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 73 ayes and 54 nays, the bill is repassed as amended by conference. Its title agreed to.
Message from the Senate. This is the LeMieur motion. Mr. Speaker, I hereby announce that the Senate has concurred in and adopted the report of the Conference Committee on Senate File 1717. The report's addressed to the Honorable Michelle L. Fischbach, President of the Senate, the Honorable Kurt Zeller, Speaker of the House. We, the undersigned conferees for Senate File 1717, report that we've agreed upon the items in dispute and recommend as follows. The report is signed by all three conferees on the part of the Senate and all three conferees on the part of the House. LeMieur moves that the report of the Conference Committee on Senate File 1717 be adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by conference.
I recognize the author, the gentleman from Morrison, Representative LeMieur, who will explain the report.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This is the Department of Labor housekeeping and technical bill. We didn't lose any House provisions, but we did gain three provisions, 2 Senate provisions and 1 Department technical provision. One of the Senate files that we accepted was language that prohibits sprinkler requirements in single-family dwellings, and the other is an addition to the continuing education course for electricians. Right now, electricians can use 1 course, and this just adds another course for them to continue their education. And the agency language that we took is language that clarifies employee classification of independent contractors. I'd like to thank the conferees, Representative Pepin and Representative Hosh. I will stand for questions. Appreciate your support.
Is there any discussion to the conference report? There being no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion to adopt the conference report on Senate File 1717 say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails. The clerk will give the bill its third reading as amended by conference.
Third reading, Senate File 1717 as amended by conference.
Third reading as amended by conference. Any further discussion? The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And, as this came off the floor here, there was a lot of concern. There's still a lot of concern. My friend Representative Mahoney isn't here today, but the sprinkler ban is problematic. The governor in past years vetoed a standalone bill that had that in it, and I'm afraid this is going to end up the same direction. There's a lot of good parts in this bill. The technical stuff that was part of it, Sanders' bill that was added on to that I'm a great supporter of, but the sprinkler bill is going to be problematic for a lot of members and a lot of people, so just so people know, vote accordingly.
Further discussion? The clerk will take the roll on the conference report. The clerk will close the roll. There being 87 ayes and 40 nays, Senate File 1717 is repassed as amended by conference and its title agreed to. Pursuant to Rule 1.22, Holberg for the Committee on Ways and Means calls up for immediate consideration Senate File 1808. The clerk will report the bill.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Point of order. I had asked earlier about...
Please state your point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the rule that you just referenced says that any bill must be considered, there has to be at least 2 hours given prior to voting on it. And now, I had asked the Speaker very specifically about that, and he said 2 hours. Well, Mr. Speaker, that was at 3:35 p.m. It is now 4:20. I don't know if this is some new way of counting time, but Mr. Speaker, that is definitely not 2 hours. Mr. Speaker, proper citation is 1.22.
Thank you. Advice? Gentleman from Clay, Representative Lanning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This bill was on the fiscal calendar four different days last week. I believe that is plenty of notice. I would have liked to have had the bill heard last week. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Members, this bill was first posted on the 14th of March. We took final action on the bill on the 20th of March, and on the 21st it was sent to the committees. It was sent forward to the House floor and to the appropriate committees. Members, I believe that there has been more than sufficient notice that this bill was to come up.
I'm ready to rule on the point of order. The gentleman from Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that you're ready, but there is no other way to read the rule as it pertains, and to the member from Moorhead, read the rule book. That's all I can say. Read the rule book. Mr. Speaker, I do believe that prior to bringing this up, there has to be a motion to suspend the rules, and I think that's a 2/3 vote, if I'm not correct.
After having listened to the gentleman from Scott and the gentleman from Clay, I rule that the point of order is well taken. The gentleman from Clay, for what purpose do you rise?
Mr. Speaker, I would like to move that we suspend the rules to take this bill up at this time.
The gentleman from Clay moves for a suspension of the rules.
Mr. Speaker?
A discussion?
Yep.
Excuse me 1 second. Members, the motion is debatable. The gentleman from Scott, Representative Bezgins, to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to members. And I'm going to speak particularly to the freshman members of the GOP party who came here to say you were going to change the way things are done. You were going to bring more transparency to this body, more openness to this body. You were going to change the culture of how this body works. Well, we just saw how you felt about that with Representative Adkins' statement when it came to a bill we just voted on. A bill that was supposed to go to conference committee, a bill that changed between both the House and Senate, and the conference committee was never published, it never met in public, and it came with a brand new bill to both bodies. And you sat here and you went along with it. That is not changing the culture and how things get done. That is going along to get along. That is status quo leadership. And some would call it lemmings. Now, members, we have in a rule a piece of openness and transparency that says any bill that comes before the fiscal calendar has to be reported by 5 o'clock of the previous day. Later on in the session, we waive that and say, well, at least 2 hours ahead of time. so that people can talk to those most interested, and those most interested who are watching on television can get in touch with their legislators. And now, in the rush of the final moments, folks, we're going to suspend the rule. To those people who came here to change the culture, this is not the way to get things done. This is not changing the culture. This is status quo, and you haven't changed a darn thing. Well, there's a chance to stand up and say, wait a second. I'm going to do what I told my voters I'm going to do. At least abide by one little rule, for goodness sakes. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a roll call.
Roll call having been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The gentleman from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would urge that members vote along with Representative Lanning to suspend the rules.
Discussion. For members' information, suspension of the rules takes a 2/3 majority, which would be 90 votes. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 97 ayes and 28 nays, the motion to suspend the rules on Senate File 1808 is adopted. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File 1808 on the fiscal calendar, the second engrossment, an act relating to retirement.
The gentleman from Clay, Chairman Lanning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and thank you for allowing this to finally come to a vote. Senate File 1808 has already passed the Senate. It is totally identical to the House version, House File 2199, and that House file, carried by me, was passed through Government Operations and Ways and Means. To particularly newer members of the body, the Pension Commission is a very different kind of committee because it contains, it's composed of 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate. In the House, I would like to thank our colleagues, Representative Kiffmeyer, Representative Smith, Representative Murphy, and Representative Kahn. This commission is in effect a conference committee. We hear bills both that originate in the House and those that originate in the Senate. And we bring forward to you a compromise bill with regard to the issue of pensions and what we ought to do. Last year we had an omnibus bill that had to be pulled together in a very short period of time. Our commission, current commission, really didn't get organized until May 1st of last year. And yet we were able to resolve an issue that had been going on for years and years, and that was the consolidation of Minneapolis Police and Fire into PERA, a very contentious issue that took a lot of hard work on the part of many people. We didn't have a lot of time to do much else as a commission last year, so we decided that we wanted to have a series of meetings last fall. And the Commission committed to 6 days of meetings last fall to undergo a study of our pension system in Minnesota and to look at what other kinds of possible reforms or things we ought to do to improve our pension system. We first of all reviewed the results of the 2010 reform. And members, for the newer members, that reform package passed in this body in 2010 has been paying very significant dividends to our pension funds. It was a very difficult thing to do because that bill lowered cost of living adjustments, it reduced benefits for some, it increased employer and employee contributions for many people. And as a result of those difficult, tough decisions, we have realized nearly $6 billion in savings. And we have seen a substantial reduction in our unfunded liabilities. But I want to quickly point out, members, our unfunded liabilities are still too high. And that needs to be an issue that we pay continuing attention to along the way. Lest you think that Minnesota was the only state that undertook in the last 2 years reform with regard to its pension, I can tell you that there were 41 states. Minnesota was one of 41 to undertake significant pension reform. And members, we believe that Minnesota's pension funds are in as good a shape as most, better shape than many in the country. And we believe that there are still, even though we have made significant progress and change, that there are some significant issues to address. So last fall, the Pension Commission undertook a study of some additional things that we might do to improve our system. And we undertook and are proposing several other reforms. The first reform that we're proposing is related to the assumed rate of return. Members, we've been assuming for a long time now that our pension funds would earn 8.5% earnings a year, 8.5%. And I passed around a document that shows that that is the highest in the country. 5 out of the 9 highest assumed rates of return among funds in the country are Minnesota funds. We believe that that is something that we need to pay attention to. If you look at our rate of return the last 10 years, it's been 5.9%. And that includes 1 year where it was 23%. And still, we only managed a 5.9% return on our investments. What happens if the next 10 years are no better? We put ourselves in a position of having made promises to our employees, to our retirees, that we may not be able to keep. And so this bill is proposing that we go down to an 8% assumed rate. By the way, the same percentage that our state economist has recommended, and that over the next 5 years, all of the funds would have to go through an experience study to see how our assumptions are working or not working, and to really take a good hard look so that the legislature, after the next 5 years, can determine whether or not we need to make additional changes. And the legislature would be able to decide that. The bill says that it would go back up to 8.5%, in effect only if the legislature deems that to be an appropriate move. Members, this change is supported by all the major funds, and we ask you for your support today. Secondly, there's a provision in the bill that requires transparency. Representative Biskins and others, all of us talk about transparency. Well, this bill has an important provision that requires MMB to provide more and better information as to the status of all of our funds. And I want to particularly thank Representative Banyan for his work on that issue. This initiative will actually provide us with a one-stop retirement funding reporting system. The third reform that's in this bill is to require that the PERA study the threshold for PERA eligibility. Right now, the monthly salary, monthly wages of employees has not been adjusted since 1988. And this bill requires that that analysis be undertaken, and I think it's pretty obvious that there are going to need to be some adjustments down the road. Another important reform in this is to finish off the mergers of independent funds into PERA. The last two independent funds to be joining PERA under this bill would be the Virginia Fire and the Fairmont Police Relief. This is a major reform that started years ago. At one time we had 44 independent funds, and let me tell you, you can't really keep track of how healthy 44 funds are around the state, and so this completes that reform started years ago. Well, members, more reforms are needed. We took a good look, long hard look at some kind of hybrid that would look at defined contribution, being able to do that, to offer that option to employees, to be able to add that element. Unfortunately, we weren't able to come to any conclusion or consensus on where we ought to go with that, and so that issue remains before us. Finally, members, this bill has a number of technical fixes requested by all the various funds to solve some of their problems and issues. This bill also provides for Federal Revenue Code conformity. That's an important element. And finally, there are individual bills in this omnibus bill for 9 different House members. With that, members, I stand ready for your questions.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Biskins and others moving to amend Senate File 1808, the second engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded 6A.
The gentleman from Scott, Representative Biskins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for a roll call.
Roll call having been requested. Are there 15 hands? Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. The gentleman from Scott, Representative Biskins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the member from Moorhead, the author of the bill, yield for a question?
The gentleman will yield. The gentleman from Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lanning, you mentioned, I think, 3 or 4 reforms, and then some ideas for reforms that you couldn't find consensus on. In your bill, Article 13, Section 3 is a piece that I think is almost synonymous with reverse reform. In that section, we have 10 employees from the Duluth Port Authority who right now have a pension. They have a pension. It's a defined contributions pension, but you are now moving these members into a defined benefits pension. Representative, did this article come from the Pension Commission? Was this one of their pieces that they moved forward?
The gentleman from Clay, Chair Lanning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and Representative Biskins. This was a bill by one of our members.
The gentleman from Scott, Representative Biskins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and obviously, members, without saying so, the member just told us this was not a recommendation from the Pension Commission. In fact, members, the Pension Commission had a 40-page document they produced which was a concern with this little piece in the pension bill. Members, The representative made one telling statement, and I wrote it down verbatim. He said one of the problems with our pensions is a problem of, quote unquote, making promises we may not be able to keep. Well, folks, I don't know if you've had your head under a rock or buried in sand, but there's two big financial issues out there right now after the mortgage crisis hit the stage. They are college tuition and public pensions. And one of the biggest issues when it comes to public pensions that every single economist, in fact more economists than those who think global warming actually is real in the scientific community, what they say is that a defined benefits pension plan is killing our taxpayers. And we need to move away from that. And we have. In the state of Minnesota and nationally, public employers have moved away from a defined benefits contributions retirement plan into a defined contributions retirement plan. And even a dummy like me can figure out why. But what a dummy like me can't figure out why is why we are in this bill taking 10 employees who have a retirement plan, folks. It's not like they're sitting out there with nothing when they retire. They've got a plan. And we are moving them from defined contributions into defined benefits. I, for the life of me, can't figure that out. It makes no sense. It makes no sense to me. It made little sense to the Pension Commission. I hope, at least in this body, there are 68 people who agree that it makes no sense to them either. I please hope you can support my amendment.
Discussion to the amendment. Representative Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support the Biskins amendment. This is a provision that I have had some trouble with for all the reasons that the good representative mentioned, in addition to some of the things that Representative Lanning had mentioned. These employees, as we've been told, are coming into this PERA fund with their own funding, and it's fully funded, so it shouldn't be a problem. But we listened to what Representative Lanning said, that in the future, we're going to assume that they're going to have a rate of return on that investment from 8.5% or 8%. But over the last 10 years, we've only seen a rate of return of 5.9%. So what we have are 10 employees, and I'll give you the fact that it's only 10 employees, shouldn't be a big deal, but it is a matter of principle. You've got 10 employees coming in who took their jobs and worked very hard under an agreement that they'd be paying into a retirement plan that was a defined contribution plan, not a defined benefit plan. And now they want to change that. So what we're doing is we're saying it's okay for the state to take on additional liabilities because these 10 employees think they can get a better deal now after they've worked and paid under that previous agreement all these years. And for me, that's wrong. I voted against the motion to suspend the rules because I wanted to draft an amendment that would put these employees into PERA, but would do it under a defined contribution plan, not a defined benefit. And that does exist. I actually have one of those PERA plans. I served as a county commissioner for 6 years, and I paid into a defined contribution plan. So PERA can do that. These employees could be in PERA under defined contribution. And everybody I've asked that question to hasn't been able to give me an answer as to why we're not doing that. When I asked if we could get an amendment drafted to do that, and I understand that doing that at the last minute here is a little bit late, it gets a little bit messy to make sure that we're catching all of the details. But I believe that's the right thing to do. So I'm rising now to speak in support of Representative Biskins' amendment and asking you, let's pull this out, let's send this back, and let's have this discussion for another year. And let's talk about some of these options, because there are other options. All we've done is talked about the option that these 10 employees want, which is to go into a state-defined benefit plan, which is contrary to the working arrangement that they've had all these years that they've worked for this Port Authority. And because they feel that there are other employees who have gotten a different benefit, that they somehow should be entitled to the same benefit. And I don't agree with that. So let's vote in favor of this amendment to pull these employees out. They'll stay in the same defined contribution plan they have now. In another year we can revisit this. We can talk about some more creative solutions. And maybe we can resolve this and get these people into para under a plan that doesn't put the state under more liability, and that I think is more consistent with the agreement they've had with their employer for all these years. So I'd strongly ask you to support this amendment. Thank you.
Member from St. Louis, Representative Rukavina.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and Representative Biskins. You know, members, Representative Anzels would probably appreciate this, and other members. Representative Anzels, like about 1937 or 38, I think my father was fighting for a defined benefit plan back then. You know, as were many people across this nation. And I heard some people, I think I heard my former governor as he was leaving the governor's office, Governor Palente, talk about how America, he was running for president then though, and America can't afford defined benefit plans anymore, but I wonder what his defined benefit plan is going to yield per month. And I heard the former Speaker Swigum talk about defined benefit plans, and I don't know if he ever said we couldn't afford them anymore, but I know he's getting a dandy one, right? Representative Carlson, you know the formulas. Representative Murphy, you know the formulas. I'm sure the former Speaker and now the Senate, whatever leader over there is getting one. And then my Congressman Krabak, I heard him after he got elected. This country can't afford defined benefit plans anymore. I think he's getting 2, maybe 3. I am not sure if he's got one from the Navy, but I know he's got one from the Northwest Airlines, and he'll have one from Congress. It never ceases to amaze me on the other side. How could I forget my good friend Representative Cornish, who I think has 3 defined benefit plans. Representative Erickson, I know, has 1. No? Oh, you went to defined contribution? I need to give you a lesson in economics then. Okay, Representative Fabian, I'm sure, has a defined benefit plan. I know my good friend Representative Downey's father has a defined benefit plan. Representative Banyan and Representative Bills, they all have defined benefit plans. Isn't it wonderful? You know. No, members, for 100 years, people in this country have been fighting for a decent pension plan. And Representative Lanning, I commend you for trying to fix up the public pensions that people not only deserve, but they have contributed to, and I commend you for that. But I really do get somewhat tired about listening to how evil defined benefit plans are when some people who condemn them, who have the option not to accept them, always do accept them, because a defined benefit plan is much better than a defined contribution.
The member from Clay, Representative Lanning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in opposition to the Biskins amendment. Members, this provision is not precedent. It is not a precedent. In 2003, the legislature and the governor approved the St. Paul Port Authority members to become a part of PERA as well. Members, this is not simply a city port authority. This is a seaway port authority for the state of Minnesota. They're not unlike the Metropolitan Airports Commission. And the staff of the Metropolitan Airports Commission are in PERA. Members, when it comes to the issue of defined contribution and the fact that they currently are in a defined contribution, let me read a quote from Larry Martin, our director, on this issue. And here's what he says: if a hybrid retirement plan arrangement to replace PERA General is recommended by the Pension Commission in the future, this Duluth Port Authority legislation would not be any insurmountable impediment to any future hybrid plan legislation. So if you're afraid that somehow we're shutting the door on future changes relative to defined contribution, I think that refutes that. And I also want to emphasize, members, these 10 people have to bring with them 100% of their actuarial responsibility. They are not going to hurt the existing fund, they're actually going to help it. They're going to have to help bring the unfunded liability down in the future, and so it is a benefit to PERA. Well, members, I would urge a no vote.
Member from St. Louis, Representative Murphy M.
Mr. Speaker, members, I too rise to oppose the Biskin amendment, and I would like to correct something that Representative Doubt said, in that he was talking about that the employees have been paying in. The port has been paying the contributions into the pension, and in this case, now the employees will also be participating in their pension plan, which up to this point they have not. And yet they are still coming into the plan fully funded. So one of the things that has been said in complaints about pension plans today is that employees have to participate more in their own pensions. By allowing the 10 employees at the Port of Duluth to come into the PERA, we are indeed allowing them to participate in their pension.
Member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I would rise in opposition to the Biskins amendment in favor of the chair of not removing that portion. And the reason is that I'd like to address our freshmen too. I think that Representative Biskins has slightly misled you. I came in here my first year too thinking I was going to get the whole world by the tail in one fell swoop, and when I went home I had kind of slunk shoulders for a bit because I didn't get everything I wanted. But I think you folks have realized here that you don't always get everything you wanted, and some part of it's compromise. You have to have some respect for the job that your chairs do. And Representative Lanning is no pushover liberal that's going to get taken advantage of by the unions, if you might think that. He's a conservative, and he made a good deal, the best deal he could get. You don't always get everything you want. And I think he did a good job, and you are doing a good job here too. And you're going to get some of the things you want, and I'm going to get some of the things I want, and we're certainly not going to get everything. And I would advise you to stick by your chair. He's here a number of years for a reason. He's got some pretty good wisdom in making the deal, so thank you.
Member from Scott, Representative Biskins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I guess if I'd encourage you to stick by anything, it's your principles. Now, I'm going to agree with Representative Lanning that this piece is not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. We're talking about 10 employees when the active members in pairs 139,000 and service retirees 62,000. Yeah, these 10 employees are like spitting into the ocean. I will disagree with him that this is going to actually help the fund. It's not going to help the fund. But it's not going to be catastrophic to the fund either. Now, members, this is a fund that is 75% funded. In most actuarial examinations, 75% funded in a retirement plan is horrible. You look far closer to 85 to 95%, not 75%. And most economists will tell you that number is not going up, it is going down. Now I'm going to quote to you what Mr. Martin, seeing as we're quoting him, what he put in his report. He said that it may be more appropriate to include all port authorities in future para-retirement coverage at large rather than the Seaway Port Authority of Duluth. Now we're not talking a spit in the ocean, we're talking about actual numbers, because members, there are 23 port authorities. If we put this one in, 23 port authorities still out. Still out. And they include a port authority in Albert Lea, in Austin, in Bloomington, in Breckenridge, in Hastings, Coochin County, Rosemount, Roseville, St. Cloud, War Road, and Winona. Why are they out and these in? Well, because it's not their time yet, I guess. We'll piece them in later. Because if we just piece them in a little at a time, it's no big deal. But when you add them all up, it's a big deal. Stick with your chair or stick with your principles? Yes, that's the real question. But Mr. Speaker, members, I know how this game is played after 14 years. I truly do. And there are some members who are dying to vote for this amendment and lose, and then go ahead and vote for the bill. So they can go back and say, I tried, knowing it was just a game. This is no game. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to withdraw my amendment, and I'm going to ask every member to vote this bill down.
Representative Biskins withdraws his amendment. There being no additional amendments at the desk, the clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File 1808.
Third reading. Discussion. Additional discussion. The member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I'm not on the Pension Commission, but I've had the privilege for 6 years of being on the State Government Finance Committee and the Government Operations Committee, the two committees that the pension bills traditionally go through. This one did not go through State Government Finance, I don't believe, but I think that's okay. We've certainly seen enough of the pension bills. Members, some of the things I think people need to understand is that Minnesota is doing quite well when it comes to its pension funds and its total bonded debt. We are in the top 10 when you put together all of Minnesota's debt obligations. Now, some people might want us to be number 1 or number 2 or, superstar number 1 and have no pension obligations and no construction or capital investment debt. But being in the top 10 shows a pretty good record of fiscal responsibility and restraint when it comes to the kind of pensions obligations that we take on and the kind of capital investment obligations that we take on. Minnesota does pretty well by and large. And members, it's important to understand that when we look at this change from 8.5% to 8% for 5 years, there's really nothing to justify it. If you look at over the last 27 years, the average annual rate of return for the Minnesota State Board of Investment is well over 9%. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 9.3 or 9.4%, well above our current statutory target of 8.5%, and certainly well above 8%. I understand that Wall Street analyst projections indicate that we should be lowering that expectation in future years. And I understand that some pension funds around the country are lowering their expectations, although those pension funds are in different positions than Minnesota is in. So that's not a very good benchmark. And a common thing that we all do is that we tend to project forward what is going on right now and imagine that it's going to continue happening forever. I think Representative Banyan, I don't know what the official economics or social science term for that tendency of human nature is, but we tend to see what we're doing now and think it's going to be that way forever. And the one thing we know is it never will be. We know that whatever we think is going to happen in the future is not going to happen. And because we've come through a very difficult economic time, we've come through a roller coaster ride on the stock market, we assume that these difficult times that we've been living through are going to be the difficult times that we live through for years to come. And yet there's nothing to suggest that that's the case. There's no justification other than the feeling of analysts and the feeling of economists that the stock market and the market's rate of return in future years is going to be declining. But there's nothing to indicate that that's actually so. And this could be far worse. I mean, I will acknowledge that, Representative Lanning. This could be far worse. But there really is no justification to switch from 8.5 to 8 for 5 years. And the danger of doing that is that, and if we stayed at 8 forever, or if we went to 7.5 forever, the danger of doing that is you create the appearance of a greater unfunded liability, which may create the political groundwork for requiring the state to pay more money, or requiring public employees and retirees to sacrifice more in order to make the funds whole. But it's still just an expectation or a prediction of future market return. So, members, I don't think that this change, this 8.5 to 8% change, is necessary for 5 years. By limiting it to 5 years, we are minimizing the gap that we are creating. And we should acknowledge that. And I know that if other members had their way, it would be a much greater gap that we'd be dealing with. But this really is a responsible pension system, a responsible and effective state board of investment. It has worked well at 8.5% for years. There's no reason to expect it will be different in the years to come. And in no circumstance should we use this change to create an expectation that somehow public employees should be forced to sacrifice even more than they have. We made some important reforms in 2010. Those reforms have not fully been realized yet, and I think, in my opinion, the safer and more conservative course of action is to leave the 8.5% number alone and allow time for the legitimate and justified reforms to take hold. So, members, I'm not going to be voting yes on this bill tonight. Obviously, my influence on other members is limited, and I wouldn't presume to tell you how you should vote, but I'm going to be voting no. I think that we should stay the course on our pension system, not mess with our funded and unfunded liabilities, and let things sort themselves out over the years to come as we come out of this profound economic turbulence and move into years of hopefully steady growth in the decades to come. So, members, I think this is unnecessary. It could be worse. I'm going to vote no, and I hope that others will consider whether making changes now is really justified, or whether it's just a political statement that we are including in a bill in order to appease certain members and certain organizations.
The member from Isanti, Representative Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I was disappointed that my good colleague from I don't even know where you're from Scott County, Representative Biskins, withdrew the amendment that would have pulled those Duluth employees out of this bill. I think there's a lot of good reasons to vote for this bill, but unfortunately, because of this provision, this bill will not be earning my vote today. And I'll just make the case again. We're taking 10 employees, and sure, 10 employees doesn't sound like a lot, but we're taking 10 employees who, and thank you, Representative Murphy, for correcting me, who didn't pay in. I think that helps to make my case, actually, who didn't pay anything out of their own pocket under the defined contribution plan that they're currently under, but they did agree to work under that plan. They took their jobs and worked for many years under that plan, and now they've decided they want something different, and they've requested to move into a defined benefit plan under PERA. And Representative Cornish's comments that you don't always get what you want are pretty fitting for these employees. Because as I ask the question, why are we doing this? The answer that I continually received from everybody involved was, that's what these employees wanted. Not because it made sense, not because we should do this, we're doing it because that's what they wanted. Well, you don't always get what you want. And unfortunately, we're going to bring employees in to a program, and we're going to guarantee their benefits during retirement, and we're going to assume from the day that we bring them in until they retire, if this bill passes, an 8% rate of return. When the bill author told you over the last 10 years, we've only seen a 5.9% rate of return. What that is it's more liability to the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota to bring employees in who really shouldn't be in this program. They didn't agree to be in this program. They took their jobs under different terms. And I'm sure they've worked hard, and I'm sure they were happy to have those jobs. But they did it under the premise of a defined contribution plan, not a defined benefit. And members, I'll remind you that this right here is what people in your district that work in the private sector hate about government. This is it. Taking people and giving them a benefit that they shouldn't have because they're government employees, and there are other government employees who have this benefit. This is what people in the private sector hate. So when you go back to your district and all the people who work in the private sector who are struggling, who don't have a defined benefit plan, ask you why you put 10 more employees in that don't have a reason to be in that program, that never agreed to work under those terms, you can explain to your private sector employees why you're shoehorning them into some government program. Because this is it, members. This is what the private sector hates about government.
The member from Stearns, Representative Banyan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was going to say for the membership, first of all, that Representative Rukavina thought maybe I was on a defined benefit plan. I'm an economist. I'm also a forecaster, and I can tell you there are many cases where my forecasts are wrong. Here's one example. I decided to get out of the defined benefit plan in 1988, go to defined contribution plan, because I wanted something that was portable. I wanted something I thought I could move from state to state with. Well, guess what? After we have a child and we think about all the places we lived, we said, man, Minnesota's great. We should go back there. And if I could go back and undo that change I made back then, I might, because frankly, defined benefit plans have been a pretty darn good deal. The question is whether or not they're a good deal because of the money we put in, or the money, whether it's the money we put in as an employee, whether it's the money my employer puts in, or the money that we receive as a return on the investment. That, in fact, is the issue that we've been talking about in terms of an assumed rate of return. Representative Murphy, you talked about the Duluth folks coming in as fully funded. You're right. They come in fully funded, actuarially fully funded, but they come in actually fully funded at an 8.5% assumed rate of return. They don't come in at a lower rate. So we're assuming, and I want you to understand what this means, members. This means that someone who comes into this group is being brought in, as Representative Doubt just talked about. We're going to take their assets, we're going to put them in the pile along with all the other assets, and we're going to assume those assets grow at 8.5%. Even though we now know that we might need to make some adjustment on that. And I've been pushing for this for a while, and while it sounds like I may be critical, I have to give a lot of thanks to Representative Lanning for chairing the Pension Commission, for tolerating not once, not twice, but I think 3 times I got to speak before the Commission on this particular issue. They heard the discussion, they made a decision, their decision is what you see in the bill, to go to 8 for 5 years and 8.5 thereafter. If I really wanted to do something about it, maybe I would have brought an amendment beforehand, before third reading, but I chose not to because I understand the Pension Commission has sort of a special status in this institution. It hears all the bills, it makes a decision on a very bipartisan basis, and I can tell you from having become a Pension Commission groupie, a fan who attends meeting after meeting, I'm really impressed with the work they do. And that might sound crazy that I'd be a fan of this, but I am. And I want to just say, to Representative Kahn, Representative Murphy, Representative Lanning, Representative Kiffmeyer, Representative Smith, thank you for the work you do. It's not easy what you do there. You made a lot of really hard decisions. So I'm saying this friend to friend as I now am going to talk about what the impact of this decision on the assumed rate of return means that Representative Winkler was talking about. I want to show you first this graphic here that's been handed out from me to should be on every desk now. This is the impact of what happens when you decide to have the rate of return be at 8% for only 5 years and assume it go back to 8.5% versus it being 8% one time and all, setting it at 8% and leaving it there. It sounds like a trivial change. Well, after 5 years, we'll set the rate at 8.5%, but we're going to have experience studies, we're going to have all this fun stuff go on, and we'll be able to act. Well, I'll tell you what, Representative Cornish, you're right, I'm a first-year person, or first-term person. Representative Biskins, you're right, I'm a first-term person. I don't know a lot about a lot. One thing I've learned, though, is the status quo has a heck of a lot of gravity to it. the status quo tends to stay. And so if you assume 8 for 5 years and 8.5 thereafter, that's the default if you do nothing. And frankly, folks, a lot of what happens, a lot of the good bills, the 3,000 plus bills that we brought here, end up in a dustbin. And they don't happen. And the result of that is that if we assume this, what we do is we're assuming that we're going to go back, that after 5 years, all those assets, those 10 folks up in the Duluth Port Authority, and all the other folks, my colleagues at the university, and all those folks are going to get 8.5% here for 5 more years. So you can see what a difference that makes in terms of the funding formula. It's all done by an assumption. Folks, if all it took to fund this thing was an assumption, let's make it 10%. Let's make it 12%. Why not? I've just been picking through 100 years of research on rates of return on stocks versus bonds versus money markets. I could find you a study to get you 10% if that's what you want, and you'd be fully funded. It would be wonderful. But that's in fact not reality. What is the reality we live in? We live in a reality where we've gone through a bubble in the stock and tech markets back in the 1990s. The rate of return that we received on assets back then, earned by our State Board of Investment, was wonderful. But you know what? Everyone did wonderfully. How many of your friends were doing day trading in the 1990s? And how many of them are doing day trading now? Frankly, back then you probably could have just thrown darts at the bulletin board with a page of the Wall Street Journal stuck to it, and you probably could have made an 11 or 12% return. You didn't need to have anybody of any great skill to do it. So you're assuming that happens, and that's what happened in the 1990s. As Representative Dowd told you, our return in the 2000s went below 6%. So the question is, what do you expect for the 2010s? What do you expect for the 2020s? What do you expect for the 2030s? What do you expect for the 2040s? Folks, CalPERS went to 7.5%. 7.5%, not 8. 7.5%. CalPERS. All right? California. And if California is going to 7.5%, what are we still doing at 8.5%? That's the question you need to ask. So you probably are wondering, and Mr. Speaker, if I can just have a little more indulgence, why would I want to vote for a bill that has this assumption to it? Well, 2 reasons. I already told you one. The Pension Commission did a great job, and you're right, Representative Cornish, sometimes at the end you're going to have to settle for what you get. And frankly, I think we missed an opportunity with all those wonderful rate of return studies that we did in the Commission. I think we missed an opportunity, but this is what we can get, and that's going to have to be okay. But the other thing you get here, friends, is this other sheet that got passed around to you. And this comes to you from this great state of West Virginia. This is a dashboard that tells everybody who is a public employee, you can go find your pension plan, and in it you can find out what your rate of return is and what the assumptions are that are used to create that. Do we have this? Yes, we do, but you have to go pick to about page 124 in something called a CAFR. Okay, does anyone know what a CAFR is? Okay. Well, do you think the citizens of the state of Minnesota and our friends who deserve, public employees who deserve to have their money paid for, do you think they're going to pick the page 124 in a CAFR to find out if they're getting paid? I don't think so. This now gives them their information in a way we can. This is fantastic transparency. There are other bits of great transparency in this bill. There's a study to finally look at an assumption we've not changed since 1988 in terms of the threshold for which someone gets a contribution for para. I mean, that thing at $425, thank you, Representative Driscoll, for pointing that out to us. That thing at $425 a month, my daughter, who could work as a lifeguard, would make $425 a month. Do you really think they should have money set aside for a pension for them at that age? I don't think so. So we're going to get a study. I wish we could have done more, but we're going to get a study. So you're right, Representative Cornish. It is a matter of sometimes a half a loaf is better than none. There's some really good reforms in here. I wish we could have gone further, but and with all due respect to Representative Dowd, I will be voting green.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I'm realizing that a comment was said a while ago that our pension funds are in better shape. Well, maybe that's because that assumed rate of return is 8.5%. As was mentioned before, you plug in that higher rate of return, of course they're going to look better. But that's just a number thing, and it really doesn't matter what the State Board of Investments and how well they do. It does matter in the long run in the sense of the actual. But when you plug it into these formulas for the next 10, 20, 30 years, it is that assumed rate of return that drives that dynamic, that drives that. And that's really important. Well, most of the others do not have 8.5%. The large majority do not. So of course they're going to look worse. Maybe it's because they're a little more honest about that rate of return. Because if there's one thing we know, the last 30 years are not the same as the next 30 years. So what are the next 30 years going to be like? Well, we know we plugged in the number, 5 years, 8%, and then 8.5%. And so that will drive your actuarial work. And for me, it's a matter of being fair to all employees. There are employees in the past that have gotten increases in their pension, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, almost 11%. Now these employees who come afterwards are getting 0, 1, and 2. It's just not fair. You want to talk about fairness to these state government employees when you have a plan. It's important to remember that. Why? So maybe everybody gets 2% in the next 30 years. And it is important that those employees who got that higher pension return are not the ones now. The current employees are the ones who are paying in higher, getting lower returns and paying in more. And when you look at pensions, this is a long term out. We as legislators are here for maybe 1 year, 2 years. But when you're dealing with pensions, this is a very far out. It's not only the 20 years you pay in as an employee, but it's the 20 years that you get the pension benefit. That 40-year spread is what we are looking at as legislators. And that's why this is so important to me, to treat all employees fairly for what they pay in and what they get back. Now, a couple years ago when we worked on the pension bill, and I wasn't on the pension commission, but I weighed in because I saw that the MRF employees had gotten a raw deal. They were in a very unique situation. And it was a matter of fairness. They were in a very uncomfortable situation. And I stood up for them, supported them, ran the numbers, worked with Minneapolis, worked with the mayor's office, worked with everybody because of working to see to it that things were fair. But in regards to these Duluth employees who paid 0 in, the employer paid in 10%, they paid in nothing. They don't like maybe the future, don't like maybe what the decisions are made with the defined contribution, and now they want to say, I want in on defined benefit. You take a look at all of those other employees who have done that. And matter of fact, the question I have, when it's talking about bringing them in at fully funded at 8.5%, who is paying for them to come in fully funded? And so I take a look at all of those state government employees who have been paying in. We have the new retirees who have gotten 0, 1, or 2. And it is for me a matter of I stood up when it mattered, and for now I also have to stand up for all of them. And I had hoped to have an opportunity on the Duluth amendment, but not having that, Representative Biskins, I'll be in the situation that to be true to the things that I've said before, that I'll have to be a red vote on this pension bill. But it's not just about the Duluth employees. It's about fairness to all of our employees. They don't get to pick and choose. They don't get to be in, out, and do that. And they made a decision. They got a really good deal. 0 for them as an employee. 10% for the government, for the taxpayers, paid in 10%. They paid in 0, and now they want to switch. It's just not right, and I'm going to have to vote red. Thank you, members.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Kahn.
Mr. Speaker and members, first of all, I want to really thank Representative Lanning, who did a super job in getting the Pension Commission through some very sometimes tedious, sometimes contentious hearings. Let me talk about the meaning of talking about 10 people. Do you know how many total people are in the Minnesota State Pension Plan? Round number of 300,000. These 10 people are not going to cause any great disruption to the plan. And it's a decent thing to do for them, and it helps them out, and it helps the city out. Let me talk about what Minnesota looks like in the public finance finance universe. One of the reports we can look at is something that's called the Fitch ratings on public finance. Minnesotan, when Representative Bennion said maybe we should look at CalPERS. CalPERS, in a rating from low to high, and looking at the rank of public debt, CalPERS is 29th in the country, and California is, and Minnesota is 10th. The change to in addition, Minnesota has the debt and pension allocation. So this kind of applies to the bonding bill that we're going to be looking at soon too. The debt and pension allocation for Minnesota as a percent of personal income is 4.6%. Again, that's 10th in the country. California is 8.9%. There are many other states, obviously, with 10th that are far worse than we are. The change to the interest rate assumption is very well thought out. It lowers the assumed rate of return to 8% for the next 5 years, and all pension funds will prepare experience studies of all the factors that go into determining the funding of pensions, retirement ages, salary growth, contributions, investment returns, and others. This will allow the legislature to comprehensively review our pension funds. Minnesota's pension debt is 1.6% of personal income compared to 3.9% nationally. This comparison used a constant discount for all states. Fitch then combined the bonded indebtedness of states in their pension plan, as I said, and Minnesota had the 10th lowest. Simply stated, Minnesota does not have a crushing problem with pensions. This bill, like the 2010 pension reform bill, keeps us moving on a fiscally responsible path. I encourage members to support the work of the Pension Commission and vote in favor of the bill. And one of the things that you need to know is that all of the funds support this approach to the bill. All of the working components support this approach to the bill. It's a good bill, and I encourage a green vote.
The member for Itasca, Representative Anzels.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lanning, my sincere thanks to you and the Commission for your work. It's not easy. You weren't handed adequate tools to do better for workers, but you did your best, and I'll be voting for the bill. Representative Dowd, you brought private sector workers into this discussion. Unfortunately, you mentioned private sector workers not appreciating or supporting public sector workers. Once again, dividing workers, Representative Dowd, doesn't work. I'll tell you about private sector workers and their government. Private sector workers who depend upon their government to support their contracted benefits and terms and conditions of employment. On the Mesabi Iron Range, we have 1,000, yes, 1,000 steel workers who have been cheated out of their mining company pensions. because of bankruptcy laws and because of the inadequacy of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. We have private sector workers whose pensions were funded at 83%, and they're getting 40 cents on a dollar. And many of them should have been retired 8 or 9 years ago, and they're still there, toiling in the mine to qualify for their pension. All because their government failed them. So, Representative Dowd, please don't divide public sector workers from private sector workers. We're all in this together. And Representative Dowd, finally, everybody in the chamber knows what you want public sector workers to get is always less. Less pay, less pensions, less quality workplace. That's wrong, Representative Dowd. And once again, thank you, Representative Lanning, for doing a good job with the bill.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And I, too, want to thank Representative Lanning for the hard work that he did on this bill. I, in the past, have served on the Pension Commission, and, we talked this about we should all switch all the government employees to defined contribution plans and get rid of defined benefit pensions. But a study that we had a few years back when I was on the Pension Commission that came out that showed that for a government, for an employer like ours that's going to be going on for a long time, it's cheaper, 40% cheaper to fund defined benefit pensions than defined contribution pensions if you want to get the same level of benefit. Let me repeat that. It's 40% cheaper to fund a defined benefit pension. So if we're true fiscal conservatives, we should be doing that, putting people in defined benefit pensions, because it's cheaper for us as a government to do that and to fund those plans, to give those people the benefit that they need when they retire so they can live a good and fruitful life after they get done working. Now, that put aside, I want to take people back here. Remember, there's a little bit of history, and maybe Representative Dowd isn't old enough to remember this, but back in the 80s, when President Reagan was in office, they changed the ERISA laws. And before that, the ERISA laws said for a pension, to qualify for a pension, you had a 10-year vesting rights. You had to work there 10 years to get a pension. And part of the pension relief plan that was done under Reagan was they changed it from 10 years to 5 years. But the other piece they put in there is they created these defined contribution plans, and the idea was, just like Representative Banyan said here, is to give people portability with their pensions. Because even at 5 years, they were finding people weren't staying in their jobs more than 5 years. They were working 3-4 years and then moving to the next job and moving to the next job, and then they wouldn't have a pension. So that's what these plans were created for, is to allow people, and it was that time mostly younger people, I was younger at the time too, but young people, to be able to take their pensions with them, so that at the end of the day, with their working lives, when they go from all these jobs, they have a pension, that defined contribution, they have a savings plan set up that they can then use to retire on. But that's all it is a savings plan. You can outlive that defined contribution pension if you make the wrong choices, or if you have a stock market crash like we had in 2008. When before 2008, if you looked at our pension plans, most of them were at or near 100% funded, and a few of them were over 100% funded. So it was the stock market crash that caused this so-called deficit that we have in our plans. And the work that we did a few years back with Representative Smith and Representative Murphy and myself on the pension plan is we lowered the COLAs, which just got us into trouble in the 90s when everything was going great, and the pensions kept rising because of that. And we took care of those problems. We lowered the COLAs. We increased the amount of money that both the employer and the employees had to pay into their plans so that they would fix this problem. And it was reported by Representative Lanning. It's been taken care of. We're heading in the right direction. Not as fast as we'd like. We'd all like to be at 100% funded, but they're moving in the right direction. So this is the good thing that we did back then. We need to pass this bill. The work that's being done here is good work. Some of the things in it I'm not 100% happy with, but they did good job. They did a good job on the Pension Commission, and we need to support that and support our members that serve on that.
The member from St. Louis, Representative Gauthier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Doubt brought up that you don't always get what you want. And then he railed against 10 employees that want to go into a pension plan fully funded. But just earlier in this session, just a few days ago, we changed state law for a racetrack because they wanted it. They didn't need it, but they wanted it, so we gave it to them. So I guess it depends on whether you're a racing industry or if you're a hard-working person, whether or not you get what you want in this government, in this body. Members, we need to play some fundamental fairness here. These people have worked hard all their life. They're not asking for anything more than what they deserve. It's not costing the state. You heard members of the commission say this is not going to have an effect on our plans, and yet we're bickering about it. We're bickering about it, and we're telling workers you don't get what you want. I think it's about time to start showing respect for the people that do the work around here. Show some respect for the people that keep our world port in top order, Representative Doubt. That move that taconite down the Great Lakes. Show some respect. Members, vote red on this amendment.
Call upon the author of the bill from Clay, Representative Lanning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope Representative Gauthier understands that that amendment that I opposed was withdrawn. Members, this pension work, as you could tell from the discussion today, is very complex and difficult work. Minnesota is in a good position compared to many other states, but we have still issues that we have to address. And you can't change and reform a system overnight. It takes slow increments. We made some major important changes in 2010. These reforms in this bill will take us another step towards helping to make our pension funds more stable and reliable in the future. So members, please vote yes.
There being no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll. The clerk will close the roll. There being 104 yeas and 24 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. The member from Carver, Representative Hoppe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and members, I move a recess to call of the chair until approximately 6:15. And the GOP members will caucus briefly in 217 immediately after we recess.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The DFL members will caucus immediately after recess as well, in 316.
Representative Hoppe moves a recess to the call of the chair. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Opposed, say nay. The motion prevails. We are recessed to the call of the chair.